The early churches were not in power. They had a very strained relationships to the power, beginning first as a persecuted minority. Within a 300-year window, they became the power. And that was a really strange change. And as we look at church history, there are some manifestations of that are both fascinating and terrifying. We live in the legacy of some of those shifts and consequences. So I want to pause there for a second. We'll come back to that in a second. But I want to put something up for you. When people talk about different kinds of churches, I notice that a lot of the categories seem to fall into sort of these patterns of threes. So we talk about big mega churches and medium-sized churches, which we know are really struggling right now because both attendance rates and giving rates have changed. And so maintaining a middle-sized church is really a struggle right now. And then small churches are trying to figure out what does ministry look like. It's one of the reasons we've been sort of a laboratory here, is figuring out how to do small church in a sustainable way, maybe a model of something that they could do to engage their community in a different way, and also be in a different kind of relationship with each other, so that they're not staging a performance every week, but that they are moving towards a conversational model. So I'm really excited about that. A lot of times if you look at sort of belief systems, especially within Protestant churches, people break it down into mainline churches like ours, more evangelical churches who are sort of in more popular or visible these days, and then charismatic churches. And we've talked before about how the Pentecostal charismatic churches are not only the fastest growing part of the church around the globe, they are now the largest. And so you always have to account for that, even if that's not your own sort of tribe or tradition. We also talk about rural, urban, and suburban context for ministry, because they're three very different things. And I just want you to know I love learning as much as I can from people in different traditions and different perspectives and different locations. I'm fascinated by the whole thing. But as I have been looking at this, I have actually found a very different pattern. And so today I want to talk to you about how churches relate to power. So this is sort of my lens that I've started utilizing, because I figured out that in my travels and in all of my conversations with people of different congregations and different denominations, that different churches have a different relationship to, for today, let's call it the status quo, the powers, the system, the man, for those of you who were in the 60s. The way that we relate to the way things are, the established order, the institutional powers. And so here's sort of, I'm going to give you these three categories, and we'll talk about some nuances within them. But one type of church is a Messianic church. And Messianic churches have an expectation that the fix to our broken system is outside of the system. So whether that is from the spiritual realm or the heavenly realm, whether that is an apocalyptic or an end times or an eschatological solution, that God, who is not a part of what's happening here, is not causing this problem, that God's going to fix it. Now, we can partner with God through prayer and through service, but ultimately our hope, or let's call it today, salvation, is from beyond or is from above. Is this something you're familiar with? This is what, when we talk about Christianity, this is what a lot of people know as Christianity. And it's Messianic, which is fine because we are inheritors of a Jewish tradition of the Messiah. And we happen to be one, started as a minority group, became a very large group of people who believe that the Messiah came and will come again. So sort of a litmus test, if you are a Messianic church, is if you talk about things like intercessory prayer or an interventionist God or a second coming of Christ, you might be in a Messianic church. All right? So that's sort of one approach. There's another approach I've noticed, which is that some churches take on more of a therapeutic emphasis. They take on primarily caring for people within the system. So whereas the Messianic church looks for salvation outside the system, therapeutic churches, and I would put us in this category, therapeutic churches help people to be their best self within the system. So in this established order that we have of democracy and capitalism, and within those are the givens, the variable is how you are a person of faith within that equation. right? And so the main thing, and there's different jokes that get told about these type of churches, but the reason that they became the main line of Christianity was after World War II, groups like us, Methodists, became the prominent expression of Christianity in America, where it was very formal, right? We had liturgy, and we were able to build all these beautiful buildings, and we were able to do overseas missions and all of these things. And so we have this huge institutional structure, and we became the main line. And now we're going through a little bit of a challenge because we have been sidelined. We're no longer the main line, we're the sideline, and we don't know what to do about it. We're having an identity crisis because we are in what they're calling a decline narrative, where we're trying to figure out how to keep our churches open and how to keep our buildings from falling into disrepair. And so we've taken on a therapeutic approach where we're helping people to have their best life now. So that's a litmus test. If you ever have a sermon series or a sermon about you having your best life now, or being the best version of yourself, you might be at a therapeutic church. Okay? Everyone tracking with me so far? Thanks. Good feedback. There's a third category, which is the prophetic church. And the prophetic church tries to change the unjust elements of the system. So instead of the messianic, which is hope from outside of the system, or therapeutic that helps you adjust to the system, prophetic churches are trying to change the system. And so in the prophetic tradition, churches organize, they advocate for those on the margins, for those who are disadvantaged, for those who are being harmed by the inequalities and injustices built into the system. Okay? So those are the three categories of churches that I sort of find people being primarily focused. That's not interesting, and I know that. Here's where it gets interesting. Let's put up the next slide. Here's where I think this gets really interesting. All three of those types seem to have a secondary emphasis that fuels their primary expression. And the fact that this is almost across the board and is so predictable fascinates me. I think it's fascinating whenever something is too predictable. And so that's why this caught my attention. Messianic churches, right, who are looking for help from the outside, often have a therapeutic element to them where until God comes and delivers us, or until the second coming, they try and help people with the bruises of life and being worn down and burned out and dysfunctional families. So there's a therapeutic element that says until salvation comes or until deliverance comes, here's how to be a healthier version of yourself, right? And this is the role of faith. This gets called the opiate of the people, right? There was a big study that was done about a decade ago called American Grace about religion in America, and they found that most Christians in America, their view of God is what they call a therapeutic cosmic butler. Right? So God's sort of out there, like Santa Claus, he's keeping a list of the naughty and nice. And once in a while, if you pray and say, God will help sort of clean up your mess. But mostly, it's just a therapeutic cosmic butler. That's sort of the predominant view of God in America, they found. Therapeutic churches, and I would put us, again, in this category, often have a prophetic element where we're trying to heal up and be the best versions of ourselves, but then we go out and try and make a difference in the world and change the system. And so whether it's advocating for those on the margins, whether it's dealing with issues of justice, for us right now, it's stuff like immigration and homelessness, that we have a heart of compassion for those who aren't doing well within the system. So therapeutic churches often have a prophetic element to them. And then prophetic churches often have a messianic element that's fueling them, because they look to the Old Testament prophets, let's say, and the prayers of the psalmist that say, let justice roll down. But it's tough to be prophetic and try and change the system if there's no resources from outside the system. And so prophetic churches often have a messianic element. Well, here's where it gets a little weird. Each of these seems to neglect the third element. And I am fascinated with this. Messianic churches, which have a therapeutic element, often totally neglect the prophetic. So they have no mechanism in their churches for protest, for civil disobedience, for advocacy for those on the margins, for issues of social justice. It is a neglected element. It's like the third trailing car is just left behind. But in churches like ours, sometimes we have this therapeutic approach, right? We do some prophetic good in the world. But you might question our real belief in God, in a God? That messianic element, that there might be help, there might be resources outside the system, that if we really prayed and we really believed and we really served, that God would come through and change this thing. That might be called into question. In prophetic churches, who have a messianic expectation, unfortunately, sometimes neglect a therapeutic element. So they're people who are out fighting for good in the world, are burned out and worn down and discouraged, and it's a real problem of fatigue, compassion fatigue. So I'm going to give you some examples of these three because I think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So I just want to tell you some examples of things good that I have seen out there. So when I was a pastor in a different tradition, an evangelical tradition, we would have definitely been messianic. Like in our doctrinal statement, a quarter of our doctrinal statement was the soon coming king, right? That was a big deal to us, the second coming. And you had to have a premillennial understanding of the end times, right, to count. So God comes, Christ comes again, and then the world gets better. That's premillennial. So the reign of Christ doesn't start until the second coming. So that's premillennial. And so we were really good at the messianic stuff, the intercessory prayer, all of that spiritual warfare stuff. And let me tell you a story about a family that has haunted me. We had a company in our town, a big publishing company, prints most of the magazines you and I would read. And they had a hiring practice of seasonal layoffs. And so every, say, 30 weeks or so, they would lay like a quarter or a third of their workforce off so that they weren't full-time workers and didn't get all the benefits, right? It's a really terrible hiring practice so that they don't have to take care of people. Well, we had a family in our church that was always laid off seasonally, and it would cause them a crisis of faith. So when they would come and say, Dave is off work again, we did a great job on the ground caring for them, right? In a therapeutic way. And we did a great job of interceding for them, lifting them up in prayer, asking God to give the family a job and supply their needs. But there was a missing gap. It never once dawned on me, and I didn't know to do this back then, that if I had gone to the 50 pastors who came to my pastor's prayer breakfast that I attended monthly and said, are any of you guys affected by Quad's seasonal layoffs? And they said, oh yeah, it affects the families in our church. And I had said, we should organize and we should go and say, what you're doing hurts our families and we're not going to read your magazines and we're going to form a protest until you change your hiring practices and stop doing this to people. I didn't know that was possible. So we had a messianic, we beseeched God on their behalf in prayer. We had a therapeutic in that we cared for the family, brought them meals, helped them pay rent, whatever. But we were missing that prophetic element that says the system needs to change. Okay? So that's an example of how we can learn from each other. So in therapeutic churches like ours, we're really good, right, at a spirituality of care and wholeness and health. We do good in the world, and that's really good. But the question has to be asked, when we are low on fuel, or when we are looking for vision for the future, or when we are inviting people up into our story, who exactly is it that we proclaim as the good news? And so that's a conversation we need to have. Prophetic churches, I have a friend whose church is, sometimes they don't meet, like on Sunday morning. And I said, well, what about if new people come? And she said, oh, well, they'll just come with us. But they'll actually go on protest marches. They'll go and do sit-ins. They'll go and advocate down, whether it's at ICE detention centers or wherever it is. And they're doing this amazing good in the world, but they are exhausted and feel like they're losing. And so they could really use a therapeutic element for a healthy spirituality that would sustain them in their work. So this is what I wanted to present to you today. And in a minute, after the offering, we're going to talk about it. So I want to give you a second. You can process some of what you're thinking. Charlie's going to call for the offering, and then we're going to talk about this.